here. Um, and I just want to start, I guess, by apologising and acknowledging that I am in fact speaking on behalf of younger generations here. I talk about children and young people all of the time, but recognising in the spirit of nothing about us without us, there really should be a young person speaking with me, or ideally instead of me. But logistics are incredibly hard to sort out at late notice, and in the UK it's an incredibly late time at the moment. So I just want to start by acknowledging my own failings here, and recognise that we're talking about a whole generation of young people who can and should speak for themselves, and encourage you all to consult and work with young people directly in your work when you can. But I think I'm here to start us a little bit of a discussion about AI and children, or specifically, I guess, how we can use AI to realise children's rights and ensure that they are safe in society. And while it may seem a bit niche, particularly for a lot of you who are here who might not have thought about this before, it's actually a lot of people. So globally, 26% of the world's population is under 15. And they are disproportionately more likely to use technology and engage with AI than other generations. And we know, I mean, anyone here who knows a young person, has a young person in their house themselves, nephews, nieces, whatever, you'll know that many of them are already engaging with AI, from, things like AI in toys, to video games, to, the algorithms that drive their experience on social media, from, recommendations to people you may know. They're all driven by various types of AI. But young people are also affected by AI in, I think, a lot of ways that we don't necessarily think about. And this particularly happens with automated decision-making. So, automated decision-making is already happening in young people's lives, from, there are lots of parts in the world where it's used in deciding benefit applications, to the provision of healthcare services, to actually there are pilot sites in the US where AI is being used to decide whether social services need to intervene to support a family or remove a child from a home. So these are, huge and big things that can have absolutely, life-changing consequences for young people. And when it goes right, we get great stuff that we've all heard about in the news, like, AI robots in children's hospitals improving their well-being, and, adaptive learning platforms that teach young people with autism better than classrooms could. There's also, some contentious examples where unquestionably great outcomes happen. But, there was the example where there was the deployment of facial recognition software at Indian train stations in 2018, which, surveillance of the public without consent. But in 1 month, it managed to unite over 3,000 lost and trafficked children with their families. It's a great outcome. But when it goes wrong, like outright wrong, we see really terrible things like, harmful filter bubbles. And the Mozilla Foundation has a great, not great, it's a good case study, terrible case study, of a 10-year-old who started watching tap dancing videos on YouTube and went down a body image sort of rabbit hole, and started saying things like, work to eat, before every meal. And you just sort of, you can't undo that sort of harm. To, algorithmic bias. And as Jeremy talked about earlier, the kind of mutant algorithm we had in the UK, which we unleashed on school leavers who are unable to finish their exams because of COVID over here. And that algorithm actually predicted their grades based on their postcode, which in the UK, postcode is a huge marker of poverty. So they calculated expected grades and then corrected them up for those who came from wealthy postcodes, and corrected them down for those who came from lower income postcodes. And, young people either got into university or didn't on the basis of that algorithm. It was absolutely atrocious. And look, I acknowledge as I talk about this, AI has similar risks for adults, risks and benefits for adults. But I think what makes it different is that young people have additional rights. They have far more rights to protection, and far more rights to sort of engage and participate in really encouraged and enabled ways. And we as a society have more obligations towards them. And so I guess it's just thinking about, how do we do this brilliantly for young people? How do we actually make sure that AI works in ways that realizes their rights and acts in their best interest. And in a world of, I know there's loads of guidance around how AI should and shouldn't work, but UNICEF put out some very helpful guidelines around how AI should work. I'm just going to chuck the link in the chat in case anyone's interested for afterwards. It's got 9 principles in there. I currently work around issue 4, which is around data protection and privacy from a legislative perspective, or as Jeremy put it, the sort of big tech parliamentary complex. So I have my own ideas about what we need to do to make sure that AI is safe for children, but I'd be really interested in hearing what you guys think and how we make sure that all of this technology that we have and all of this AI actually works in ways that realise children's best interests and doesn't do harm. And I think that's the big question I'll throw open to the group. Does anyone have any thoughts, comments?
Double muted there. I guess I'll go ahead and start. Like your conversation kind of really led me to thinking about all the COPPA stuff that's been happening on YouTube and just how that has been crazy for some YouTube creators that are like, I don't make stuff for kids, even though it looks like they do, but they really don't. And just kind of some of the very questionable things that are openly marketed to kids and openly contain ads and probably aren't the best content for them. It does also make me lead to like, we can design AIs, but for best interests, every family has, different best interests for their children. So kind of how do we make something that'll rule for all when there's like so much variation already in what people want for their children?
Just to riff off that point, some of the work that we were looking into, which was in health systems for young persons living with diabetes last year, was also looking at life cycle models, because what you're training the system to adapt changes and access and what you want that system to achieve and the level of control that they can have in inputting into health systems, particularly AI-enabled CPSs. Changes over their life, and that level of input and the level of feedback as well was different over different spans. So it's a really interesting thing when looking at young persons and their interaction with technology, particularly with AI systems, of what does that look like as they graduate through their life cycle as well and move through their life cycle of what does that look like, is something that is really complicated to try and do for a straight system, let alone what we're training our AIs to do.
Yeah. And if you think about the sort of governance issues, the data issues and the consent around that, you have to have these AI systems that can, function over a young person's life cycle and match their evolving capacity in terms of what they can understand, what they can consent to, what sort of data can be collected. And it becomes, just increasingly difficult.
And a regulatory minefield too, because different pieces of legislation apply depending on whether it's a health record, whether it's a young person involved, parental consent, medical records. It's really quite an interesting space to try and contemplate.
And jurisdiction as well, which country your platform operates in, where are your young people? It's really
even
hard.
Which state in some cases here.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I really appreciate, centering children's opinions, as they are very vulnerable and they're the ones who are going to be left with this technology and the implications. And I think it's interesting to be born into all of these digital spaces that continue to track over your entire life. So what happens, you're tracked through school systems, through your Google Chrome, through your Google email. And when you hit 18, what happens then? Like, do you have any rights over your data to delete that? Do you have any rights to say, I was just a kid, I was just 5 years old, I said no to the teacher, it doesn't mean anything today, I'm 20 now. But that level of monitoring is really catastrophic, I think. And I think it's really important to center kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have this saying that today's generation are datafied from birth. So it's not even, you know, when you hit school, it's, you know, there are devices collecting data about children in utero, through to, you know, Fitbit data in school. And that's even, you know, data passively collected about young people. There was an estimate in the UK recently that put it at parents and family will upload 1,300 photos and videos of children before they turn 13. So before you get to even a copper bare minimum concept of digital consent, that much data exists about young people online. And, you know, data has a particular problem with permanence, and God willing, our children have a long time to live. And there's a real issue with what actually happens when there's that much data about you when you're an adult.
I think health data in particular, biometric data, those two really alarm me with kids.
It's funny, like we talk so much about, particularly with data around the right to be recognized, and how different, you know, populations are missing from our data or not appropriately recognized. But one of my Indigenous colleagues really pushes this point about, from a perspective of the right to also be forgotten. And particularly because there's a view around persons who are deceased in traditional culture here. Bringing that into data is really interesting, about this right to be forgotten that we're not encapsulating.
I mean, it's interesting. I worked with an organisation that did some citizens' juries with young people, like series of citizens' juries across the UK, to work out what did young people think their digital rights were. So not their rights as all of them applied in the digital environment, but their digital rights. And they came up with 5. And of the 5, one of them was the right to be forgotten. They wanted, Elma, exactly what you said, which was the right to click a button when they turned 18, 16, whenever they wanted it, to say, delete everything you know about me. Because that sort of stuff they didn't want following them into their adulthood.
Yeah, I think it brings into question, like, how do we even have the right to be extracting all of this data and collecting all of this data in the first place, not only to be forgotten at the later downstream edge, but how do we bring this to the forefront?
Yeah, exactly. We've got 30 seconds left, so I'm going to ask if anyone wants to volunteer to be the person who reports back. And then, Elma, just reply to your comment really quickly. There are a bunch of legislative reforms going through at the moment. So in the UK, we've got the Age Appropriate Design Code. In Ireland, they've got their Fundamentals for Child-Centred Data Processing, which is really looking at that, like how do you ensure data minimisation and data's forgotten about children. So there are some moves afoot, and Australia is just starting to look at them, but it's difficult. 30 seconds left. Does anyone want to volunteer? Melissa, do you want to volunteer?
I guess I can. I'm just so not good at capturing all of what we said. It was so good.
We talked about data. You're good.
All right.
You can lean on us for support if you want.
Thank you.